There's a structure buried in the Iranian desert that has no engine, no electricity, and no moving parts. And it can still make ice appear out of thin air. It's over 2,000 years old. And the science behind it is stranger than you'd expect. You open your freezer without thinking. Ice cubes, cold water, frozen food, all instant, all effortless. But for almost the entirety of human history, cold was one of the hardest things on Earth to hold on to. Heat spreads, cold doesn't. Left alone, ice always loses. And yet, across deserts, mountains, and river valleys, ancient humans figured out how to beat that fight. Not with machines. With dirt, shape, and an understanding of physics they never wrote down in equations, but clearly understood in practice. Let's go back to the beginning. The earliest evidence of humans deliberately storing ice comes from Mesopotamia, nearly 4,000 years ago. Archaeologists have found records of ice houses along the Euphrates River, pits dug deep into the earth, lined with insulating material, and packed with ice cut from nearby mountains during the winter. The logic was simple: go where the cold already exists, capture it before it melts, and bury it deep enough that the surrounding earth does the rest. Soil is a remarkable insulator. A few feet underground, temperature barely changes across the seasons. That's why root cellars work, why wine is stored underground, and why an ice pit dug with the right depth and drainage could keep frozen water solid through the height of summer. The workers wouldn't have understood thermal conductivity as a formula, but they understood it as a craft, passed down and refined over generations. By the time you reach ancient Persia, roughly 2,400 years ago, this craft had turned into something closer to architecture. The structures were called yakhchāls, and some of them are still standing in Iran today. From the outside, a yakhchāl looks almost like a beehive rising out of the desert, a tall dome made of a special mortar mixed with sand, clay, egg whites, and goat hair. That mixture, called saruj, was resistant to heat transfer and nearly waterproof. Inside, the structure descended deep underground into a storage chamber that could hold tons of ice through the hottest months of the year, in a region where summer temperatures regularly push past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. But here's the part that sounds almost impossible. Some yakhchāls didn't just store ice, they made it. Next to many of these structures, engineers built long, shallow pools and tall shading walls positioned precisely to block the low afternoon sun while leaving the pool exposed to the clear night sky. On cold desert nights, even when the air temperature stayed just above freezing, the water in those pools would ice over, not because the air was cold enough on its own, but because of something called radiative cooling. The water was losing heat directly to the night sky itself, radiating warmth out into the vast cold of space faster than the surrounding air could replace it. Under the right conditions, that loss was enough to freeze water even when a thermometer would have told you it shouldn't be possible. The Persian engineers didn't know about radiative heat transfer as physics understands it now. But they knew that on a clear night, in a shielded pool, ice would form, so they built their infrastructure around a reaction they couldn't yet explain, and it worked so reliably that ice production and storage became a functioning industry, centuries before anyone had a word for thermodynamics. Here's the part that changes how you should think about all of this. This wasn't a lucky accident discovered once and copied. Yakhchal builders were engineering a phenomenon that wouldn't be formally explained by modern physics until the 20th century, when scientists finally mapped out exactly how objects radiate heat into open sky. In other words, people without electricity, without thermometers, without any concept of infrared radiation, were running a functioning heat transfer operation a full 2,000 years before anyone could explain why it worked. They weren't guessing. They were engineering blind and getting it right anyway, generation after generation, purely through observation and repetition. The ice didn't just sit there either. In many Persian cities, yakhchal ice was combined with grape juice, fruit concentrates, and rose water to create falude, a frozen dessert that some historians consider one of the earliest ancestors of what we now call ice cream. Long before refrigeration existed anywhere else in the world, some ancient Persians were eating a version of a frozen treat engineered entirely from sand, shade, and the night sky. Persia wasn't alone in this. Around the same era, the Romans were building their own version of cold storage, hauling snow down from the Alps and Apennine Mountains, packing it into deep insulated pits lined with straw and cloth, and selling it in city markets during the summer months. It was expensive. It was, in many ways, a luxury good, closer to a status symbol than a necessity. Wealthy Romans would pay heavily for a bowl of snow mixed with honey and fruit, a dessert some historians point to as one of the earliest relatives of the modern sorbet. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, ancient Chinese texts from over 2,000 years ago describe ice houses used to preserve food and cool drinks for royalty, with specialized workers whose entire job was harvesting river ice in winter and managing its storage through the year. These positions were taken seriously enough to be documented in official records, complete with staffing levels and storage quotas, treated with the same bureaucratic weight as managing grain reserves. In India, some regions used a method almost identical in principle to the Persian pools. Shallow trays of water left out on winter nights, producing thin sheets of ice through the same radiative cooling effect, collected before sunrise and stored in insulated pits. What's remarkable is that none of these civilizations were in direct contact when many of these methods developed. Mesopotamia, Persia, Rome, China, parts of India, different continents, different cultures, different materials, but the same underlying discovery kept surfacing again and again. Cold sinks, insulation traps it, and the night sky, under the right conditions, can pull heat out of water faster than you'd think possible. When the same solution appears independently across civilizations that never spoke to each other, it usually means the problem was serious enough and the payoff big enough that human ingenuity found its way there again and again, through trial and error, generation after generation. This wasn't just about comfort. Preserving cold meant preserving food. Meat and dairy spoil fast in heat, and spoiled food was one of the most consistent killers throughout human history, long before anyone understood bacteria. A working ice house extended how long meat stayed safe to eat, let dairy last through a hot season, and turned unpredictable harvests into something slightly more manageable. In some regions, controlling cold wasn't a luxury at all. It was survival infrastructure, built the same way irrigation systems or granaries were, quietly determining who made it through a difficult year and who didn't. And that's what makes the yakhchāl so striking when you really sit with it. It's not just a clever trick. It's a complete system, shaped like architecture, built from a precise material formula, oriented with intentional geometry toward the sky, engineered to exploit a physical principle nobody in that era had a name for, all to solve a problem that, today, is solved by pressing a button on a box in your kitchen. We tend to imagine ancient life as constant deprivation, as if people simply lacked things and endured it, but cold storage tells a different story. It shows people looking directly at an impossible problem, heat always wins, cold always fades, and refusing to accept that as the final answer. They didn't have electricity, refrigerant gas, or compressors, so they used geometry, shade, airflow, soil, and the empty cold of space itself, and they made it work well enough that some of their structures are still standing after 2,000 years. There's a structure buried in the Iranian desert that has no engine, no electricity, and no moving parts. It doesn't need any of those things. It was never missing them. It was built by people who looked up at a clear night sky, understood exactly what it could do for them, and turned an empty desert into something that could freeze water using nothing but the dark.